How to punch like God. Matthew chapter 5, verses 43 through 48. Jesus said, "You have heard that it was said, 'Love your neighbor and hate your enemy.' But I tell you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, that you may be children of your Father in heaven. He causes His sun to rise on the evil and the good, and sends rain on the righteous and the unrighteous. If you love those who love you, what reward will you get? Are not even the tax collectors doing that? And if you greet only your own people, what are you doing more than others? Do not even pagans do that? Be perfect, therefore, as your heavenly Father is perfect." Remember, our one true purpose is to glorify God. We do this by making Him look as good as He really is. The surefire way of accomplishing this is through love. Love is not primarily a feeling. It is an action. It is a commitment to seek the best for the other. Sometimes love means restraining ourselves from action, even if it's perfectly justified. When our enemies deserve retribution and we don't give them what they deserve, God is suddenly on display in their midst through us. Dr. Robert Tuttle Jr. explained it this way. He said, "My first church after I returned from Europe was in the rural South. During the middle 60s, I had wire-rimmed glasses, hair over my ears, and a PhD, thinking, I'm their favorite son. When I'd been there no more than a couple of weeks, the radio announced they'd give 20 minutes free to anyone who wanted to speak their piece. I said, well, I'll take some of that. So I got my 20 minutes, and I begged the people of Stanley County to integrate their churches. I said the most segregated hour in the week is 11 o'clock on Sunday morning. When I walked out of the station, they were waiting on me. They didn't have their hoods on, but I knew who they were. Half of them were members of my church. They dragged me under an old oak tree and beat the living daylights out of me. Some years later, there was a man who was a member of that church who said that if he ever caught me on his property, I was his meat. That means he was just going to do whatever. Well, his barn burned, and because he was a member of my church, I went through the community taking up money to help pay for his barn. I drove my car on a hot summer day up to his house on a hill and went to the back door, which was their main door. I knocked on the screen door, and when he saw me, he backed up and kicked the door open with his foot. And the door just swung open and almost took my head off. Before I could peep, he grabbed me by the tie and was choking me. I had one hand in my pocket trying to get the money out, but it was like the monkey with his hand in the jar, and I just couldn't get my hand out. I couldn't let go of the tie either, because I was going to die. Finally, I got loose from him, and he said, "Why don't you hit me back?" You see, he was beating me on the top of my head. He was swinging me around by the tie and beating me with his free arm on top of my head. When I finally got loose, he said, "Why don't you hit me back? Why don't you hit me back?" I said, "Jesus won't let me." And when I turned around and walked to my car, he went up behind me and kicked me in the seat of my pants. I boxed for 6 years. Golden Gloves, college. I said, "Jesus, nobody should have to take that off anybody. I want to get him with a little punch. I don't want to hurt him bad." And I heard Jesus say in my spirit, "Put your rear end in the car and go home. If you're going to preach the gospel, you better try to live it." So I got in the car and went home, but I was consumed. And he was consumed. His wife said he didn't take his clothes off for 3 days. He didn't go to bed or sleep for 3 days. I had him. You know why? Because I didn't hit him back. He knew I wasn't afraid of him. I turned on him just as he kicked me in the seat of the pants, and I wanted him to see me. He knew I wasn't afraid of him. He knew by the way I looked at him. I had him because I didn't hit him back. 3 days later, I'm walking out of the grocery store, and he was sitting in his little white truck. This was back in the days before you could put your own gasoline in, so there was an attendant putting gasoline in his truck. He was sitting behind the wheel with the window rolled down. I walked over to him, put my hand through the window, put my finger on his nose, and said, "Buford, you better pray to God I never wipe out on Jesus, because if I do, I'm coming, and you're number one." And you know what Buford did? He went home and slept like a baby. I let him off the hook. Why? Because I put my hands on him. If I could have kept my hands off of him, I had him. The Spirit of God was working preveniently, and I let Buford right off the hook, and it taught me something. I want to be an instrument of God in effecting positive change in the hearts and lives of others.